April 16th, 1945, somewhere east of Essen. The shrapnel had entered Gefreiter Klaus Bergmann's abdomen 3 hours earlier, during what no one bothered to call a battle anymore. The fragment, roughly the size of a child's thumb, had torn through the lower left quadrant of his belly with the casual efficiency of hot metal meeting flesh. Now he lay in the back of a motionless Opel Blitz truck, one hand pressed against the wound, the other gripping a rifle he no longer had ammunition for. The blood had soaked through his field tunic, through his undershirt, pooling in the cracked leather of the truck bed. It was warm at first, then it wasn't. Around him, 17 other men sat or lay in various states of injury and defeat. No one spoke. The engine had been silent for 40 minutes, out of fuel like everything else in the Ruhr that April. Through the canvas flap at the rear, Bergmann could see American tanks rolling past on the road below, their treads grinding the spring mud into chocolate-colored paste. They moved with the unhurried confidence of men who knew the war was over. Every few minutes, another column would pass. More tanks, more trucks, more men who looked like they'd just stepped out of a factory that manufactured soldiers by the thousands. Bergmann was 23 years old. He had been expecting death for so long that its arrival felt almost courteous, like a long-anticipated guest finally knocking at the door. What he hadn't expected was how quiet it would be. No Götterdämmerung, no apocalyptic last stand. Just the steady drip of his own blood onto German soil and the distant rumble of American machinery. He thought about the leaflets. The Americans had been dropping them for weeks, millions of pieces of paper fluttering down like obscene snow, promising hot food and medical care, and swift repatriation after the war. "The war is lost," they read in perfect German. "Your leaders have abandoned you. Surrender and live." The men had laughed at first, then they stopped laughing. Then they stopped talking about the leaflets at all, though Bergmann had seen more than one soldier fold them carefully and tuck them into a breast pocket, close to the heart. Now, lying in a truck that would never move again, he wondered if the leaflets had been telling the truth. The encirclement had closed with geometric precision. On April 1st, 1945, Easter Sunday, the United States 1st and 9th Armies met at Lippstadt, a small town whose name would be remembered by military historians and forgotten by everyone else. The jaws of the trap had been closing for weeks, but the final snap took less than 24 hours. 25 German divisions, more than 300,000 men, found themselves sealed inside a pocket roughly 70 miles wide and 50 miles deep. The Ruhr pocket, the industrial heart of the Third Reich, now beating its last. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding the trapped Army Group B, issued orders that everyone knew were impossible to execute. Break out to the east, form hedgehog defenses, fight to the last man. The rhetoric was familiar, honed by 4 years of strategic retreat disguised as tactical necessity. But something had changed in April 1945. The machinery of military discipline, which had survived Stalingrad and Normandy and the Ardennes, simply stopped working. Orders were received, acknowledged, and ignored. Units dissolved like sugar in rain. Officers found themselves commanding no one. The Americans didn't attack the pocket so much as digest it. They moved methodically, almost gently, slicing the trapped forces into smaller and smaller segments. 60 divisions became 40. 40 became 20. 20 became isolated battalion-sized groups, then companies, then squads of exhausted men sitting by roadsides, waiting for someone to officially tell them the war was over. Klaus Bergmann had been part of the 353rd Infantry Division, a unit that existed primarily on paper by mid-April. His company, what remained of it, had been ordered to defend a crossroads near Hattingen. The crossroads was strategically meaningless. Everyone knew this. The Americans bypassed it on the second day, leaving Bergmann and his comrades to contemplate the philosophical problem of defending a position that the enemy had decided wasn't worth attacking. On the morning of April 16th, they stopped contemplating and started walking. East, vaguely, away from the sound of American armor, specifically. They moved through a landscape that looked like it had been crumpled by an angry god and then partially smoothed out again. Factories stood silent, their windows blown out, their machinery either destroyed or already dismantled by German engineers in a futile attempt to deny the enemy what they were about to capture anyway. Towns were empty, not abandoned, emptied. The civilians had fled or hidden or simply vanished into that strange liminal space between occupation and liberation. The group had been reduced to 32 men when the artillery found them. Not a barrage, just 3 rounds, efficiently placed from an American gun crew that probably never saw their targets. One moment, Bergman was walking through a field of spring wheat, green and knee-high and absurdly beautiful. The next he was on his back, staring at a sky full of dirt and smoke, trying to understand why his stomach felt like someone had punched it from the inside. Time became unreliable after the shrapnel. Bergman remembered being carried. He remembered voices in German, frightened and young. He remembered the truck, its canvas top torn, its engine coughing and dying. He remembered Private Hirsch, a boy from Bavaria who looked about 16, pressing a field dressing against the wound and whispering, "Hold on, Klaus. Just hold on." But hold on to what? The Reich was a ghost. The army was a memory. His own body was becoming an abstraction, something that happened to someone else, somewhere else. The pain had evolved beyond sensation into a kind of philosophical statement about the nature of existence. It wasn't that it hurt. It was that hurt was all there was. The Americans found them just before dusk. Or rather, the Americans didn't need to find them because they were everywhere and finding had become irrelevant. One moment the truck was alone on a country road. The next, 2 M4 Sherman tanks were parked 20 yards away, their cannons trained on nothing in particular, their crews smoking cigarettes and looking bored. An officer, a captain, judging by the bars on his collar, approached the truck with the casual confidence of a man inspecting livestock at a county fair. "Any officers?" he called out in mangled German. No one answered. "Wounded." Hirsch raised his hand. "He needs a doctor," he said, pointing at Bergman. "He's bleeding internally." The captain nodded as if this information was mildly interesting, but not particularly urgent. He called something in English over his shoulder. 2 medics appeared, both carrying aid bags that looked impossibly well stocked. They climbed into the truck bed, moving with practiced efficiency. The first medic, a thin man with corporal stripes and eyes that had seen too much, examined Bergman's wound with quick, impersonal precision. He cut away the soaked field dressing, probed the entry wound with gloved fingers, checked Bergman's pulse at the wrist and neck. His face revealed nothing. The second medic prepared a morphine syringe. "Perforated bowel, probable," the first medic said in English. Then in fractured German, "You go hospital, now, schnell." Bergman tried to process this. Hospital, now, schnell. The words didn't make sense strung together like that. In the German army, men with perforated bowels died in field hospitals after waiting 18 or 24 hours for an overworked surgeon who usually didn't have anesthesia or proper instruments or, increasingly, any reason to believe the patient would survive the operation. You didn't take men with gut wounds to hospitals now. You triaged them to the bottom of the list and hoped they died before their turn came. The morphine hit his system like a warm blanket thrown over a frozen man. The pain receded to a distant throb. The medics lifted him onto a stretcher with surprising gentleness. As they carried him toward an actual ambulance, purpose-built, with red crosses painted on the side, Bergman saw the rest of his unit being assembled on the roadside. No one was being beaten. No one was being shot. The Americans were processing them with the bureaucratic efficiency of postal workers sorting mail. Name, rank, unit, next. Private Hirsch walked beside the stretcher, his young face twisted with confusion. "Klaus," he whispered. "Klaus, what's happening?" Bergman didn't answer because he didn't know. The morphine had turned his thoughts into honey, sweet, slow. He watched the sky slide past above him, a German sky that now belonged to America, and wondered if he was already dead, and this was some kind of administrative error in the afterlife. The field hospital was not a field hospital. It was a factory of medicine, a cathedral of surgical efficiency that had nothing in common with the blood-soaked aid stations Bergman had seen on the Eastern Front. It occupied what had once been a German elementary school in a town whose name he never learned. The classrooms had been converted into operating theaters, complete with proper lighting, proper equipment, proper everything. The hallway smelled of disinfectant and cigarette smoke instead of gangrene and despair. They wheeled him past room after room of wounded men, American and German side by side, separated not by nationality, but by the type and severity of their injuries. A German Unteroffizier with a shattered femur lay next to an American private with a sucking chest wound. Both were receiving the same care from the same doctors with the same sense of urgent competence. In the Eastern Front hospitals, nationality meant everything. Germans first, always. Allied prisoners last, if at all. But here in this converted schoolhouse, the only hierarchy was medical. The worst wounded went first, regardless of the uniform they'd worn that morning. The triage nurse, an American woman with steel-gray hair and the demeanor of a Prussian drill sergeant, examined Bergman's chart for perhaps 5 seconds. "Or 2, she said crisply. "Prep for immediate laparotomy. Type and cross-match 2 units. Bergman understood perhaps 1 word in 3, but he understood the tone. This was a problem that could be solved, would be solved. Now. They moved him into an operating room that gleamed under banks of electrical lights. Actual electrical lights, bright enough to read by, powered by generators that hummed steadily in the background. The surgeon was a major, perhaps 40 years old, with the hands of a pianist and the eyes of a man who'd stopped being surprised by the human capacity for damage. He studied Bergman's abdomen with clinical detachment. "How long ago?" he asked in German that was better than Bergman expected. 3, 4 hours, Bergman managed. The surgeon nodded. "You're lucky. Another hour and peritonitis would have you." He turned to his team, switching to English. "Classic penetrating trauma. Entry wound lower left quadrant, no exit wound. Fragments still in there. We'll find it. Patch the bowel, lavage, and close. Standard work. Let's make it fast and clean." An anesthesiologist appeared above Bergman's face, a kind face somehow, despite belonging to an enemy. "Count backwards from 100, he said in accented German, in your own language. For your mother." Bergman thought about the leaflets, about the promises of hot food and medical care, about the cynicism with which he and every other soldier had dismissed those promises as propaganda, as lies designed to break German morale. He thought about the fact that no one had asked him if he wanted to live. They'd simply assumed his life was worth saving and gone about saving it with the industrial efficiency that America brought to everything. Tanks, bombers, and now surgery. 100, he began. 100. 99. 99. The anesthesia pulled him down into darkness that felt nothing like dying. He woke to whiteness, white ceiling, white walls, white sheets that were actually clean. For a moment, the complete absence of lice seemed more miraculous than his own survival. A nurse was checking his pulse, a young woman, American, with the focused expression of someone performing a task she'd done 10,000 times. When she noticed his eyes were open, she smiled. "Welcome back," she said in English, then switched to careful German. "You are okay. Surgery good. No infection. You rest now." Bergman's hand moved instinctively to his abdomen. He found bandages, properly applied, and beneath them the dull ache of sutured tissue rather than the liquid fire of septic injury. Someone had operated on him. Someone had saved his life. Someone had done this without making him wait, without triaging him to the bottom of the list, without the casual assumption that German soldiers with gut wounds were expendable resources not worth the morphine. To his left, an American sergeant with his leg in traction was reading a magazine, an actual magazine, glossy, filled with photographs of women and cars and advertisements for things Bergman had half forgotten existed. To his right, a German corporal was sleeping, his breathing steady, his color good. Both men had IV drips running into their arms. Both men were receiving the same care. A doctor made rounds an hour later, not the surgeon who'd operated, but a younger man, a captain, who checked Bergman's chart and his incision and his vitals with the same methodical attention he gave every patient, German or American. He explained the surgery in simple German. They'd removed the shrapnel, repaired 2 perforations in the small intestine, cleaned the abdominal cavity, closed everything in layers. He'd need to stay still for several days, then gradually increase activity. Barring complications, he'd make a full recovery. Full recovery, the doctor repeated, as if this was the most normal thing in the world. As if saving the life of an enemy soldier was simply what doctors did. Policy and propaganda and politics be damned. Bergman wanted to ask why. Why save him? Why waste precious medical resources on a German private who'd be a prisoner for God knew how long? Why treat him with the same care given to American soldiers who'd actually earned this country's loyalty? But he didn't ask, because somewhere beneath the morphine and the shock and the lingering disbelief, he was beginning to understand something that the leaflets had tried to tell him, and he'd been too conditioned by Nazi propaganda to believe. The Americans weren't fighting a race war. They were fighting a war, period. And when the fighting stopped, so did the hatred. Not for ideological reasons or because they were saints, but because cruelty required effort and America preferred efficiency. The food appeared at noon. Not a bowl of thin soup or a crust of black bread, but an actual meal. Boiled chicken, mashed potatoes with butter, green beans, white bread, and, impossibly, a small square of chocolate for dessert. The orderly who delivered it was German, a prisoner of war assigned to hospital duty, and his hands shook slightly as he set the tray on Bergman's lap. "They feed us like this every day," the orderly whispered in German, as if sharing a secret too dangerous to speak aloud. "3 meals, hot, with meat. They say it's because of the Geneva Convention, but I think they just have so much they don't know what else to do with it." Bergman stared at the chicken, at the butter melting into the potatoes, at the chocolate that sat there like a small brown miracle, wrapped in waxed paper printed with English words. He thought about the last 2 winters on the Eastern Front, where men had killed each other over frozen potato peelings. He thought about the ration cuts that had started in '43 and never stopped, until German soldiers were marching on empty bellies and fighting on anger alone. He ate slowly, carefully, because his stomach wasn't ready for real food, and because some part of him was afraid the meal would vanish if he moved too quickly. The chicken was bland, under-seasoned, clearly designed for injured digestive systems, but it was hot and real and more protein than he'd eaten in a single sitting in 6 months. The chocolate melted on his tongue with a sweetness that felt almost profane. Private Hirsch appeared in the afternoon, brought by an American MP who seemed more bored than vigilant. The boy from Bavaria stood at the foot of Bergman's bed, his face working through expressions faster than he could control them. Relief, confusion, anger, shame. "They fed us," Hirsch said, his voice breaking slightly. "Klaus, they fed us white bread and coffee with real sugar, and they didn't make us wait. We just walked in and they gave it to us. All of us. 300 men from our group alone, and they had enough for everyone." Bergman nodded. He understood what Hirsch was really saying. Understood the cognitive dissonance that was tearing through every German soldier in American captivity. How do you reconcile being treated humanely by an enemy you've been taught to fear? How do you process kindness from people you expected to deliver revenge? "Where are the concentration camps?" Hirsch asked suddenly, urgently. "Where are the torture chambers? The Ami bastards who shoot prisoners for sport? That's what they told us. That's what we were supposed to believe." "I don't know," Bergman said quietly. He did know, of course. They all knew. The propaganda had been so obvious, so crude, that even the most fanatical believers had started to doubt it by 1944. But knowing propaganda as lies is different from confronting the specific shape of those lies, different from lying in a clean bed with a sutured belly, being kept alive by the very people you'd been assured wanted you dead. The Ruhr pocket collapsed in sections, like a building falling floor by floor. By April 20th, the pocket had been split into 2 smaller pockets. By April 21st, those had fragmented into dozens of isolated groups, each one making its own decision about when and how to surrender. There were no grand last stands, no Wagnerian death rides. Most German units simply stopped moving, stacked their weapons in neat piles, and waited for American trucks to collect them. Field Marshal Model, commanding officer of Army Group B, disbanded his forces on April 15th and ordered his men to try to escape east as individual soldiers. For 6 days, he wandered through the collapsing pocket, perhaps hoping to find a death in combat that would spare him from facing trial for war crimes. He didn't find it. On April 21st, in a forest near Duisburg, he shot himself in the head. His last words, according to his aide, were, "Have I done everything that was required of me?" The answer, inscribed by history and numbers, was no. In 3 weeks of encirclement, the Americans captured 317,000 German soldiers, more prisoners than they'd taken in all previous operations in Western Europe combined. They killed approximately 30,000. They destroyed or captured thousands of tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, and aircraft. They did this while suffering fewer than 10,000 casualties of their own. The military historians would call it the cleanest victory of the war, the largest encirclement in American military history. A masterpiece of maneuver warfare that proved you could destroy an enemy army without destroying an entire landscape in the process. But for the men who lived through it, the German soldiers who'd expected death and found hospital beds instead, who'd expected starvation and found hot meals, who'd expected punishment and found only the bureaucratic efficiency of prison camp administration, the Ruhr pocket was something else entirely. It was the moment when the cognitive framework of Nazi Germany finally collapsed under the weight of American abundance. Klaus Bergmann understood this on his 4th day in the hospital, when a Red Cross representative appeared with a form that would allow him to send a letter home. One letter, 25 words maximum, to let his family know he was alive and a prisoner of war. The representative was a middle-aged American woman with gray hair and reading glasses perched on her nose. She spoke German with a Bavarian accent. An immigrant, perhaps, or the child of immigrants, returned to Europe in an American uniform to process the debris of a war her ancestral homeland had started and lost. "Your family will be worried," she said gently. "Let them know you're safe." Safe. The word felt like a key turning in a lock Bergmann hadn't known existed. He was safe, not because he'd fought well or because his cause was just or because God favored the righteous. He was safe because he'd been captured by an army that had so much food, so much medicine, so many resources, that treating enemy wounded was simply standard operating procedure, no more remarkable than changing oil in a truck. He wrote the letter carefully in his best handwriting. "Mother, am alive, wounded but treated well. Prisoner near Ruhr. Do not worry. Will come home. Klaus." 23 words. He had 2 left but couldn't think of what to add. What do you say when your entire understanding of the enemy has been revealed as lies? How do you explain that you're alive because the people you were taught to hate decided your life was worth saving, even though they had no obligation and you'd done nothing to earn their mercy? He left the last 2 words blank and handed the form back to the Red Cross woman. She smiled, made a notation, and moved to the next bed. Bergmann spent 17 days in the American Field Hospital. Long enough to watch his incision heal pink and tight. Long enough to regain strength sufficient to walk the length of the hallway without assistance. Long enough to witness the daily miracle of American logistics. Clean bandages that appeared every morning without fail, hot meals delivered on schedule, medications dispensed with pharmaceutical precision. On the 2nd of May, Germany surrendered. The news rippled through the hospital ward with the emotional weight of weather report. Men cried quietly. Men stared at walls. Men wrote letters home that would take weeks to arrive, assuming the addresses still existed and the people who lived there were still alive. The American staff continued working with the same steady efficiency they'd shown throughout. The war was over. The work remained. A psychiatric officer made rounds that afternoon, a major with kind eyes and the careful speech patterns of someone who'd studied human trauma from textbooks and was now seeing it in 3 dimensions. He asked Bergmann a series of questions that seemed designed to assess his mental stability. Did he know where he was? Did he understand the war was over? Was he experiencing thoughts of self-harm? Bergmann answered truthfully, "Yes, yes, no." "You're going to a processing center," the psychiatrist explained in excellent German. "From there, probably to a permanent camp in France or England. The war crimes investigators will interview you, routine for all prisoners. If your record is clean, repatriation should begin within a year, possibly less. Germany will need to be rebuilt. You'll be part of that. A year, possibly less. Bergman had prepared himself for death or indefinite imprisonment. He hadn't prepared for the possibility of going home, of rebuilding, of a future that extended beyond the next meal, the next day, the next breath. One more thing, the psychiatrist said more gently. You're going to hear things about what happened in the camps, the concentration camps, the death camps, things that will make you question everything you believed about your country. Most of what you hear will be true. All of it will be worse than you imagine. My advice, don't try to defend it. Don't try to explain it away. Just listen. Bear witness. Remember, Germany is going to need people who can remember and still choose to build something better. The psychiatrist moved to the next bed, leaving Bergman with a kind of vertigo. He knew about the camps. Every German soldier knew, in the way you know something without knowing the details, without letting the knowledge become real enough to require action. But hearing an American officer speak about them so plainly, so factually, stripped away the comfortable layer of deniability. The camps were real. The atrocities were real. And he had served in the army that had guarded those camps, that had enabled those atrocities, even if he'd personally never set foot in one. What did you do with that knowledge? How did you carry it? On May 9th, Bergman was transferred to a transit camp near Remagen, where the Americans had crossed the Rhine in March. The camp held perhaps 3,000 German prisoners, all waiting to be moved to more permanent facilities. It was, by prisoner of war camp standards, almost comfortable. Tents provided shelter, latrines were dug in neat rows, food arrived in trucks 3 times a day, not gourmet but sufficient, predictable, safe. Bergman shared a tent with 11 other men, including Private Hirsch, who'd somehow managed to stay close throughout the processing. They didn't talk much. What was there to say? The war was over. They'd lost. Everything they'd been told about racial superiority and destiny and the inevitability of German victory had been revealed as lies wrapped in propaganda and sealed with blood. At night, lying on a canvas cot in a tent that didn't leak, listening to the sounds of men breathing and occasionally weeping and sometimes laughing at jokes that weren't funny, Bergman thought about his wound, about the American surgeon who'd operated without hesitation, about the nurses who'd changed his bandages with the same care they gave their own soldiers, about the food and the medicine and the systematic, almost boring efficiency with which the Americans had dismantled his entire worldview. The propaganda had been right about one thing. The Americans were different, but not in the ways the propaganda had claimed. They weren't racially inferior or culturally weak or morally bankrupt. They were different because they had so much of everything, that they could afford to be generous, could afford to waste medical supplies on enemy soldiers, could afford to feed prisoners the same rations their own troops ate, could afford to treat the Geneva Convention not as an inconvenient suggestion, but as minimum standard operating procedure. Abundance, Bergman realized, changes the moral calculus of war. When you're starving, every loaf of bread is a zero-sum game. When you're drowning in wheat, sharing becomes the path of least resistance. Germany had fought a war of scarcity and lost. America had won a war of abundance. The difference was written in every meal, every bandage, every unnecessary kindness that cost the Americans nothing and cost their prisoners everything they'd believed about the nature of the enemy. Private Heinrich Müller arrived at the transit camp on May 12th. Bergman didn't recognize him at first. The man had lost perhaps 30 pounds. His face had become a skull wrapped in gray skin, and his eyes held the particular emptiness of someone who'd seen things that couldn't be unseen. But Müller had served in Bergman's company before being transferred east in December 44, and recognition sparked when he spoke. "Klaus," Müller said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Klaus Bergman. I thought you were dead." They sat together in the weak spring sunshine, 2 survivors of different hells. Müller had been captured by the Soviets near Königsberg, held in a forest pen for 3 weeks with minimal food and no shelter, then somehow transferred west to American custody through a prisoner exchange no one bothered to explain. "They shot the wounded," Müller said flatly. "The Russians. Just lined them up and shot them. said they couldn't afford to treat enemy soldiers when their own people were starving. I watched them do it. Officers, enlisted, didn't matter. If you couldn't walk, you were dead. Bergman felt his scar itch beneath the bandages. The Americans operated on me, he said. 3 hours in surgery, removed shrapnel, repaired my bowel, gave me morphine and antibiotics, and 3 meals a day until I healed. Miller stared at him. Why? I don't know. Did you have intelligence? Were you important? I was a private. I knew nothing. I was nobody. They sat in silence, processing the implications. In the East, wounded prisoners were executed for logistical convenience. In the West, they were operated on by board-certified surgeons using equipment that would have been luxury goods in German military hospitals. The contrast wasn't just about resources. It was about fundamental assumptions about the value of human life, even enemy life. We chose the wrong side, Miller said finally. Bergman wanted to argue, wanted to defend something. The memory of early victories, perhaps, or the abstract notion of duty, or the claim that individual soldiers shouldn't be held responsible for their government's crimes. But the defense wouldn't come. It had been surgically removed along with the shrapnel, cut out and discarded as necrotic tissue. Yes, Bergman said, we did. The camps taught them, not through deliberate instruction, but through the architecture of daily life. The Americans ran the transit facility with the same organizational efficiency they brought to everything. And that efficiency revealed assumptions that German prisoners had never thought to question. Meals arrived on schedule, cooked by German prisoners under American supervision. The food was simple but sufficient. Breakfast of oatmeal and coffee, lunch of soup and bread, dinner of beans or stew with meat. Every prisoner received the same portions. No favoritism, no hierarchy, just the mechanistic equality of industrial food production. Mail was distributed weekly. Letters from home arrived bearing the stamps of occupation authorities, British in the north, French in the southwest, American in the center, Soviet in the east. The letters were censored but not destroyed. Prisoners could write back, 1 letter per week, 25 words. The privilege of communication wasn't earned through good behavior or collaboration. It was simply granted, like air, like sunlight. Medical care continued. A dentist visited twice a week, treating cavities and infections. A doctor held sick call daily. Men with chronic conditions, diabetes, heart problems, persistent infections, received medication and monitoring. This wasn't about compassion exactly. It was about maintaining inventory. The Americans had captured 300 to 17,000 prisoners in the Ruhr alone. Dead prisoners were paperwork. Living prisoners were a manageable problem. The pattern was everywhere once you learned to see it. The Americans treated problems as technical challenges to be solved with resources and systems. German prisoners weren't enemies to be punished. They were logistics problems to be processed. The absence of malice was almost more devastating than overt cruelty would have been. Cruelty you could resist. Hate transform into martyrdom. Bureaucratic indifference was absolute. On June 4, 1945, the newsreels arrived. An American captain announced that all prisoners would be required to watch footage of the concentration camps. Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, others. It was not optional. It was part of processing. Part of ensuring that no German soldier could later claim ignorance. They assembled in a mess tent converted into a makeshift theater. 3,000 men sitting on the ground, facing a white sheet strung between poles. The projector whirred. The first images appeared. Bergman had prepared himself. He knew about the camps. Everyone knew. But knowing and seeing were separated by a chasm wider than the Rhine. The footage showed corpses stacked like cordwood, living skeletons with eyes that had stopped registering the camera. Mass graves bulldozed by Allied troops wearing gas masks against the smell. Children, so many children. Men vomited, men wept, men shouted denials that sounded hollow even to themselves. The footage continued, relentless, documentary, unbearable. American narration in clipped military English, translated into German by an interpreter whose voice never wavered. Buchenwald concentration camp. liberated by elements of the United States Third Army on April 11, 1945. Estimated 21,000 prisoners alive at liberation. Estimated 56,000 dead over the camp's 8-year operation. The numbers were written in letters on the screen, spelled out, inescapable. 21,000, 56,000. At Dachau, 32,000 alive, over 41,000 dead. At Bergen-Belsen, 60,000 alive, at least 50,000 dead in the final months alone. Bergman thought about his surgery, about the care he'd received, about the surgeon who'd looked at his perforated bowel and seen a problem to solve rather than an enemy to abandon. And he thought about the camps, where German doctors had looked at human beings and seen experimental subjects, where efficiency had meant murder rather than logistics, where the same organizational competence the Americans used to run POW camps had been twisted into machinery of extermination. The same culture, the same language, the same love of order and systems and precision, but pointed in opposite directions, toward death, toward life. When the lights came on, no one spoke. The American captain stood at the front of the tent, his face expressionless. "You will be asked about this," he said in German, "by the investigators, by the tribunals, by history. Some of you may have served near these camps. Some of you may have guarded them. Some of you may claim you didn't know. That claim will not protect you. Not from justice, not from memory, not from what you've just seen." He let that settle, then continued. "But most of you weren't guards. Most of you were just soldiers, following orders, fighting for your country. The question you'll have to answer isn't about what you did. It's about what you do next. Germany will need to be rebuilt. That rebuilding starts with remembering, with bearing witness, with refusing to let this happen again." They filed out of the tent in silence, 3,000 men carrying new weight. Bergman found Hirsch sitting by the latrine trench, his face blank, his hands shaking. "I didn't know," Hirsch whispered. "Klaus, I swear I didn't know." "I know," Bergman said, though he wasn't sure if he believed it or if belief even mattered. They'd all known something, enough to stay silent, enough to look away, enough to let it happen. The repatriation began in August 1945. Priorities were clear. Farmers first, to help with harvest. Skilled workers second, to rebuild infrastructure. Everyone else would wait. Bergman, classified as light industrial labor due to his pre-war work in a textile mill, was told to expect release in late autumn. He spent the summer in the transit camp, which had transformed from temporary holding facility to semi-permanent city of canvas and corrugated metal. A bizarre economy emerged. Cigarettes as currency, watchmaking as employment, a black market in letters and photographs, and small luxuries that made prison time bearable. The Americans supervised loosely, intervening only when violence threatened or when someone attempted escape. Rare, since escape meant abandoning regular meals and medical care for a Germany that existed now only in ruins and occupation zones. Letters from home arrived sporadically, bearing news that felt like dispatches from another planet. Bergman's mother wrote in August that she'd walked past their old apartment building. The entire top 3 floors had been destroyed by bombing, but the ground floor was intact and now housed 4 families instead of 1. His father had died in March, she wrote matter-of-factly, not from violence but from pneumonia, weakened by malnutrition and age. The funeral had been simple. She'd saved the good suit for when Klaus came home. He read the letter sitting on his bunk, the words blurring slightly. His father had died while Klaus was recovering in an American hospital, eating chicken and chocolate, contemplating the philosophical implications of abundance. There was an algebra to guilt that had no solution. You survived because of chance. Others died for the same reason. The randomness was unbearable, so you searched for meaning, for causality, for some narrative thread that would make the survival and the death part of a coherent story. But there was no story, just chance, just luck, just the arbitrary geography of surrender that placed you in American rather than Soviet hands, that delivered you to a surgeon rather than a bullet. Private Hirsch received no letters. His hometown, a village near Nuremberg, lay in the American zone, but responses to his weekly messages never came. In September, a Red Cross worker gently explained that the village had been evacuated and partially destroyed during the final weeks of fighting. Records were incomplete. Families were scattered. Hirsch should prepare for the possibility that his parents had died or relocated without leaving forwarding information. The boy, he was still a boy, Bergman thought, despite the uniform and the war and the year of aging compressed into months, took the news with a blankness that was worse than tears. That night, Hirsch lay on his bunk staring at the canvas ceiling and said, apropos of nothing, I killed a Russian, outside Minsk, 1943. He was maybe 17, younger than me. I shot him and he fell, and I felt nothing. Absolutely nothing. I remember being surprised that I felt nothing. Bergman said nothing. What response existed? Absolution? Condemnation? The war had made murderers of children and called it duty. The peace would demand those children become citizens and call it reconstruction. I wonder, Hirsch continued, if his mother got a letter, if she knows, or if he just vanished, like my parents might have vanished, and she'll spend the rest of her life not knowing. Probably, Bergman said. They lay in the darkness, 2 men among 3,000, all of them waiting for history to decide what to do with the debris. The investigator arrived in October, a lieutenant from the Judge Advocate General's Corps, accompanied by a German-speaking sergeant who took notes in careful shorthand. They interviewed Bergman in a tent designated for interrogations, not torture chambers, just administrative spaces with folding tables and uncomfortable chairs. The lieutenant was professional, almost bored. He asked about Bergman's service record, units, locations, dates. He asked about knowledge of war crimes, participation in atrocities, membership in the SS or SD, or any of the organizations designated as criminal by the upcoming tribunals. Bergman answered truthfully, infantry units only, no specialized assignments, no war crimes witnessed or committed, no party membership beyond the compulsory Hitler Youth that every boy had joined in the 30s. What about the camps? The lieutenant asked. Did you know? I knew they existed, Bergman said carefully. I knew Jews and political prisoners were being held there. I didn't know about the extermination, not the scale, not the machinery of it. The lieutenant made a notation. Did you suspect? This was the harder question. The honest answer was yes. Everyone had suspected something, even if they'd refused to articulate those suspicions, even to themselves. But suspicion wasn't knowledge, and knowledge wasn't participation. And the lieutenant seemed interested primarily in legal categories rather than moral complexities. I suspected something bad was happening, Bergman said finally. I didn't want to know more. I was a coward. The lieutenant looked up from his notes, something almost like surprise flickering across his professional face. Most prisoners claim complete ignorance. Most prisoners are lying. Are you lying about your lack of direct participation? No, but I was there. I wore the uniform. I served the government that built those camps. Whether I personally pulled triggers or shoved people into gas chambers is legally relevant but morally insufficient. I was part of it. The sergeant stopped writing, his pencil hovering above the notepad. The lieutenant studied Bergman with new attention, as if reassessing a specimen that had suddenly exhibited unexpected characteristics. You understand, the lieutenant said slowly, that this kind of statement could be used against you. If we were looking for scapegoats, you've just volunteered. I understand. So why say it? Bergman thought about the newsreels, about the surgeon who'd saved his life, about the contrast between the American system that treated him with bureaucratic indifference and the German system that had treated millions with bureaucratic murder, about the difference between accepting responsibility and claiming innocence. Because it's true, he said, and because someone needs to say it. If we all claim we didn't know, if we all say we were just following orders, then nothing changes. Germany just becomes a nation of victims, and we learn nothing. The lieutenant made another notation, longer this time. You're cleared for repatriation, he said. Category 3, no evidence of war crimes, eligible for immediate release pending transportation availability. You'll receive documentation within the week. The interview was over. Bergman stood, nodded, walked back to his tent through autumn rain that had turned the camp into a maze of mud and wooden pallets. He felt nothing like relief. Repatriation meant returning to a Germany that didn't exist anymore, to a country that would spend decades, maybe generations, processing what it had become. He was being released from prison into a larger prison, one bounded not by barbed wire but by collective guilt and the rubble of cities and the knowledge that they'd burned the world and called it destiny. He left the camp on November 3rd, 1945, 6 months and 18 days after a piece of American shrapnel had torn through his abdomen. The processing took 4 hours. Medical clearance, verification of identity, issuance of discharge papers, and a temporary identity card stamped with American and British Occupation Authority seals. He was given a set of civilian clothes, not his own. Those had been lost somewhere in the chaos, but similar enough. Wool trousers, a cotton shirt, a jacket that was too large in the shoulders. He was given 40 Deutsche Marks in occupation currency and a railway pass to Dusseldorf, the city nearest his mother's last known address. Private Hirsch left with him. The boy had received notification that his mother had been located in a displaced persons camp near Munich. His father was dead, killed during an Allied bombing raid in February '45. Hirsch had cried when he heard, but not much. By November 1945, most people had exhausted their capacity for grief. They rode west in a train car packed with former prisoners, all wearing similar too large civilian clothes, all carrying similar discharge papers, all navigating the same surreal transition from military prisoner to civilian refugee. The train moved slowly through a landscape that looked like it had been beaten with hammers, factories reduced to twisted metal skeletons, bridges blown into rivers, towns reduced to street patterns marked by rubble. At some point, Bergman couldn't tell exactly when, the train crossed from American to British occupation zone. The transition was invisible except for the different uniforms on the military police who checked their papers at various stops. The abundance was the same. British soldiers looked as well-fed and well-equipped as American ones. Both armies had cigarettes to spare, chocolate to trade, gasoline for vehicles that actually ran. The contrast with German destitution was so complete, it felt deliberate, though Bergman knew it wasn't deliberate so much as inevitable. The winners had won because they'd never been poor enough to lose. Dusseldorf appeared through the train window like a ghost of itself. Bergman had last seen the city in '43 on leave, when it had still been mostly intact. Now perhaps 60% of the city center was rubble. Buildings stood in isolation like broken teeth. Entire neighborhoods had been erased, replaced by cleared lots where women and old men picked through debris for salvageable bricks, scraps of metal, anything that might be sold or traded or used to build something new from the wreckage of the old. His mother's apartment was gone. Not damaged, gone. The entire building had taken a direct hit from a British blockbuster bomb, leaving a crater that had since been partially filled with debris from adjacent structures. A handwritten sign indicated that former residents could inquire at a registration office on Karlstrasse about relocation information. The registration office occupied the ground floor of a building that was missing its top 3 stories. A harried German clerk, a woman perhaps 50 years old, wearing a sweater with carefully repaired holes, checked a card catalog that was itself a miracle of organization, given the chaos. Bergman, Margaret, the clerk read aloud, relocated to Housing Block 17, Oberkassel District, shared accommodation with 3 other families. She filed inquiry forms for Klaus Bergman, born 1922. You're her son? Yes. The clerk made a notation, stamped a form, handed it to Bergman. She'll be glad you're alive. Don't surprise her. Send word first. We've had 3 heart attacks this month from men showing up unannounced after being declared missing. Bergman walked through the ruins of Dusseldorf with directions to Housing Block 17. The city was alive in ways that felt uncanny. Streetcars running on undamaged tracks, markets operating with whatever goods existed to be sold, children playing in rubble piles with the adaptability of children everywhere. Life insisted on continuing even when the structures that had supported that life had been pulverized into dust. Housing Block 17 was a converted school building that now held perhaps 60 families in spaces designed for classrooms. His mother occupied one corner of a room on the 2nd floor. a space perhaps 10 feet by 12, separated from neighboring families by blankets hung from wire. She was sitting on a narrow cot, mending a shirt by the light from a west-facing window when Bergman knocked on the doorframe. She looked up. Recognition took a moment. He'd lost weight. His face had changed. The boy who'd left for war in 42 was not quite the same person as the man who returned in 45. But recognition came. She stood, dropped the shirt, made a sound that wasn't quite a word, and he crossed the small space and held her, while she shook with sobs that she tried to keep quiet out of consideration for the neighbors whose lives were separated from hers by cotton blankets and social agreement. "I thought you were dead," she said when she could speak. "The telegram said missing. Missing means dead. Everyone knows that." "I was captured," Bergman said. "The Americans. April 16th, near Hattingen." She pulled back, examined his face, touched the place where the scar marked his abdomen through the shirt. "You were wounded." "Shrapnel. They operated. An American surgeon. They saved my life." She processed this information with the pragmatism of a woman who'd survived years of rationing and bombing, and the death of her husband, and the transformation of her world into something unrecognizable. "Good," she said finally. "I'm glad someone saved you. I'm glad you're here." They sat on the cot, there was nowhere else to sit, and she told him about his father's death, and the bombing, and the occupation, and the difficulty of finding food in the black market, and the incredible bureaucracy of survival in a country that had been simultaneously destroyed and occupied by 3 different foreign powers, plus the Soviets in the East. She told him about the newsreels that German civilians had been forced to watch, about the camps, about the shame that was now the default emotional state of being German. "Everyone says they didn't know," she said quietly. "Everyone says they were just trying to survive, just following orders, just keeping their heads down. Maybe some are telling the truth, but we all knew something. We all chose not to ask questions. That's on us. On all of us." Bergman thought about the investigator, about his own admission of cowardice, about the distinction between individual guilt and collective responsibility. "The Americans fed me," he said, 3 meals a day, hot, with meat. They operated on me without making me wait, gave me morphine and antibiotics and clean bandages, treated me exactly like they'd treat one of their own soldiers. And I kept thinking, why? Why waste resources on someone who was trying to kill them 6 months ago?" His mother considered this. "What did you decide? That they had so much it cost them nothing, and that we had so little we'd turned cruelty into efficiency. The camps weren't aberrations. They were what we built when we took German organization and German precision and pointed it at people we decided weren't human. And now? Now we live in the ruins. Now we rebuild. Now we try to become the kind of country that doesn't do that again." She nodded slowly. Through the blanket wall, they could hear a baby crying, a woman singing a lullaby, the sounds of 60 families compressed into spaces designed for learning. Life continued. It always continued. The question was, what kind of life? What kind of country? What kind of people emerged from the rubble? Bergman found work in December, clearing debris from streets marked for reconstruction. The pay was minimal, barely enough for food, paid in occupation currency that was worth different amounts depending on which zone you were in and which black market vendor you asked. But work was work, and work was dignity, and dignity was the first thing Germany had lost and the hardest thing to recover. He worked alongside former soldiers, former factory workers, former everything. No one talked about the war directly, but it was there in the silences, in the careful way men avoided asking where someone had served, in the unspoken agreement that the past was a country no one wanted to visit. They talked about the present, how to stretch rations, where to find coal for heating, which occupation authorities were reasonable and which were vindictive, whether the rumors of currency reform were true. In January 46, Bergman received a letter from Private Hirsch. The boy had made it to Munich, found his mother, discovered that his father's death had come not from bombing, but from a heart attack triggered by malnutrition and stress. The mother had survived by working as a seamstress for American officers' wives, a job that paid in cigarettes and chocolate that could be traded for actual food. Hirsch had found work in the American motor pool, maintaining vehicles, using skills he'd learned in the Wehrmacht to service the trucks and jeeps of the occupation. I see them every day, Hirsch wrote, the Americans. And I keep thinking about how we were taught to fear them, how we were told they'd rape and murder and destroy everything German. And instead, they're just people. Some nice, some not, some generous, some petty, but mostly just people doing jobs, following orders, trying to get home. Same as we were. Same as we are. The letter ended with a question. Do you think we learned anything? Or will we just wait 20 years and do it again? Bergman didn't answer immediately. The question was too large, too important, too likely to be answered by history rather than by intentions. But eventually he wrote back, a letter carefully composed over several evenings in the shared room that was now home. We learned what we're capable of, what we did, what we became. Whether that's enough to prevent it happening again, I don't know. All I know is that I was saved by an enemy who had every reason to let me die. And I lived in a country that murdered millions who had every reason to live. That contrast has to mean something. It has to change something. If it doesn't, then what was the point of any of it? He mailed the letter and went back to work, clearing rubble from streets that would someday become streets again, in a city that would someday become a city again, in a country that would someday, maybe, become a country worth believing in again. Epilogue. The Ruhr pocket was forgotten quickly, buried under the avalanche of larger stories. The atomic bombs, the Holocaust, the Nuremberg trials, the partition of Germany, the beginning of the Cold War. Military historians remembered it as a tactical masterpiece. Strategic analysts studied its lessons about encirclement and mobility and the collapse of command structures. But for the general public, it was just one more battle in a war full of battles, distinguished only by its strange efficiency and its relative lack of carnage. The prisoners dispersed into the machinery of occupation and reconstruction. Most were repatriated by late '46, returning to a Germany divided into 4 zones that would eventually become 2 countries that would eventually, after 40 more years, become one country again. They built houses and started families and tried to forget what they'd seen and done and been. Some succeeded. Some didn't. Some died young, broken by what they'd experienced. Some lived into old age, carrying their memories like scars that never quite healed. Klaus Bergman lived to be 78 years old. He married in '49, had 2 daughters, worked for 40 years as a manager in a textile factory that rose from the ruins of the old German industrial economy. He rarely spoke about the war, though his daughters knew he'd been wounded and captured and treated by American doctors. They knew he carried a scar across his abdomen, and sometimes, in certain light, would touch it absently, as if reminding himself of something. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of VE Day, a journalist interviewed him for a local newspaper article about veterans' memories. Bergman, then 73 and retired, spoke carefully about the Ruhr pocket, about the encirclement, about the shrapnel wound and the surgery, and the hospital where German and American wounded lay side by side, receiving identical care from doctors who'd stopped seeing nationality and started seeing only bodies that needed fixing. I expected to die, he told the journalist. I expected punishment. I expected revenge. What I got was 3 meals a day and a surgeon who worked on me like I mattered, like my life was worth saving even though I'd spent 3 years trying to kill people on his side. The journalist asked if that experience had changed him. Bergman touched his scar through his shirt, that unconscious gesture of remembrance. It broke something, he said. All the propaganda, all the lies we'd been fed about racial superiority and destiny and the inevitable triumph of will. All of that broke, because you can't maintain those illusions when you're lying in a clean bed, eating hot food, being kept alive by the very people you were taught to fear. The Americans didn't treat us well because they were saints. They treated us well because they were rich enough to afford mercy. And we'd built death camps because we were poor enough that cruelty became efficient. He paused, searching for words. Germany had to learn that lesson, had to learn it in blood and rubble and shame. I learned it in a field hospital near the Rhine, being operated on by a man whose name I never knew, who saved my life and then moved on to the next patient without expecting gratitude or acknowledgement. That's what abundance looks like. That's what we'd been fighting against and calling it destiny. The article appeared in a local newspaper with a circulation of perhaps 20,000. Few people read it, fewer remembered it, but the journalist kept the transcript, and decades later, after Bergman had died and Germany had reunited and the world had moved on to new wars and new crises, historians would find it in an archive and cite it as evidence of how individual Germans processed their defeat and occupation and the revelation of what their government had done in their name. The Ruhr Pocket remained what it had always been, America's cleanest victory, an encirclement so efficient it barely qualified as a battle. 317,000 prisoners taken with fewer than 10,000 American casualties. A strategic masterpiece that proved you could destroy an army without destroying a landscape, could win a war without winning through attrition. But for the men who lived through it, who surrendered in fields and forests and along roads, who expected death and found hospital beds, who learned that the enemy they'd been taught to fear was surprisingly indifferent to revenge, the Ruhr Pocket was something else. It was the moment when ideology collapsed under the weight of reality, when propaganda met abundance and dissolved like sugar in hot water, when a generation of German soldiers learned that everything they'd believed about the war and the enemy and themselves had been a lie wrapped in flags and sealed with blood. That lesson cost 300,000 German lives across the entire Western Front. It cost 6 million Jewish lives in camps. It cost 50 million lives worldwide. It cost the complete destruction of German cities and German industry and German faith in German destiny. Klaus Bergman learned it for the price of a 3-hour surgery performed by an anonymous American major who probably never remembered the German private whose life he'd saved on a spring afternoon in 1945. It should have been a more expensive lesson, or perhaps it was exactly expensive enough. History doesn't give refunds. The war ended. The occupation began. Germany rebuilt. Memory faded, then solidified into monuments and museums and history books that tried to make sense of how a civilized nation had become a factory for murder, and how its soldiers had served that factory with efficiency and then surrendered to armies they'd been taught were racially inferior, and found those armies were simply better fed, better equipped, and, when the fighting stopped, surprisingly willing to treat their prisoners like human beings who'd made terrible choices, but were human beings nonetheless. In the end, the Ruhr Pocket proved what military strategists had long suspected. You don't need to kill an army to defeat it. You just need to cut off its supply lines, isolate it from support, and wait for reality to penetrate the propaganda. Given enough time, soldiers will choose survival over ideology. Given enough evidence, even the most committed believers will begin to doubt. The Americans understood this. They fought not with ideology, but with logistics, not with faith, but with materiel. They won because they had more of everything: tanks, planes, food, medicine, fuel, and because abundance changes the moral calculus of warfare. When you have enough, you can afford mercy. When you're starving, every prisoner is a mouth you can't feed. Germany starved, America feasted. The difference was written in every meal served to prisoners, every surgery performed on wounded enemies, every decision to treat the Geneva Convention as minimum standard rather than aspirational goal. Klaus Bergman understood this in a way he could never quite articulate. He carried the knowledge in his body, in the scar that marked where American shrapnel had entered and American surgery had repaired. He carried it in his memories of clean sheets and hot food, and doctors who worked without asking whether the life they were saving deserved to be saved. He carried it until he died, in 2003, in a hospital in Dusseldorf that had been rebuilt from the rubble of the old, in a Germany that had been rebuilt from the rubble of the old, in a world that had learned, expensively, painfully, incompletely, that industrial efficiency can be pointed at either life or death, and the choice is made not by destiny, but by human beings who have to live with the consequences. The Ruhr Pocket closed in April 1945. Its lessons remain open still.